So last time we created a vector. And remember, a vector in a lot of other programming languages, it's called an array. An array is a vector, and a vector is an array, more or less. Vectors have properties where we can add things to them and delete from them, and we don't have to worry about its size, which is nice. Okay? But remember to have this visual in your head of what a vector looks like. Okay? So when we're making our vectors, they are indexed from 0 to length minus 1. So this vector has 10 bullets in it. So they're indexed 0 through 9. And each is a bullet object. So each is a new object. Okay? So we're going to create a vector of enemies today in the same manner. Okay? So when our enemies come down from the screen, we're going to house them inside a vector too. So we can keep them all together, and then it makes our code easier to write. So we don't have to make 10 different enemy variables. Okay, we like to keep them all into one vector. Okay? So let's review our code. And let me open my files. Just want to make sure my code is working. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to have our enemies come down from the sky, and when the bullets make contact with them, we hit that object, then the object will do some kind of animation. My animation's a little bit boring. It just kind of gets small and then disappears. But you guys will do some other kind of animation in there. And then we'll replace our characters, our background, make it more exciting, have a theme. Okay? And you could even have a score. All right. But let's review our code so we remember what it does. And you guys could take notes in your code by making comments in your code. Okay? So remember our import statements. Our import statements allow us to reuse code. Okay, so that allows us to use the mouse click and the mouse move event. So our mouse down event and our mouse move event. And then we have this events class so that we can use the onEnter frame event. So remember what those libraries are used for. Those are good test questions. Which library is used for the onEnter frame event? It's the event library, right? All right. Now remember also that we declare our instance variables for our game at the top of our class declaration. Okay, so remember your class name is always the same name as your file. Okay, and when we write things like extends movie clip, that means he is a movie clip, and that's why we can use all of these things. Okay, all right. Now remember that these are called our declarations. We customarily name them with lowercase letters. So when we declare our instance variables, because they're variables, we use lowercase letters for their names. And we like to give them good names about what they are. And then this is where we're declaring them of type player. We're declaring our bullets variable of type vector. Okay, that holds bullet objects. We're declaring our num of bullets as a number type. And we're declaring our enemies, and this is the code that you're going to write today. In fact, you can write it in here now if you want. We'll come back to it. We declare our enemies of type vector too. But I'll come back to this code, so if you don't get it all the way, right? Now remember that our constructor is the code that is run when we create our game. So when we compile our game, okay, hold on. Somebody escaped. That's going to look great on the video. Okay. She's so proud of herself that she escaped. All right. Here's our constructor code. Our constructor, remember, is always the same name as our class, and it's always the same name as our file. So our file the name of the class, and the constructor all share the same name. It's the only function we'll write with a capital letter. Okay? Constructors are important because constructors are run when we make an instance of this AS file or this class. So this is the code that's run when we start our game. If you're familiar with other programming languages, you can kind of think of this as your main. Okay? But he's not really main, he's really the constructor. Okay? All right. So remember that we instantiate or create our objects, our instance variables in here. So we made a new player object with the new operator. That's called our new operator. And this is actually the player constructor. He constructs our player. We set his X and Y value, and then we add him to the stage. And this kind of code should be familiar to you. You should be able to write this kind of code no problem by now in this class, okay? All right. We instantiate our num of bullets, and we don't have to use the new operator for numbers. Numbers, we could just write their number, okay? And then for our bullets vector, we had to instantiate our new bullets vector, but because he's bullet objects, we had to use this for loop to instantiate every single bullet object in our bullets vector. So we created a new bullet. We push that bullet into our vector. We then use this function that we wrote called disappear. And then we added him to the stage. So he's all ready to go. Remember that this for loop happens how many times? He starts at 0 and goes less than 10. So how many times does for loop happen? 10. Okay? So when you start at 0 and then you're less than a number, you go that many number of times around. And remember that it makes a new bullet on every for loop. So every for loop, we're making a new bullet. We're pushing it into our vector, and we're adding it to the stage. So we have 10 bullets up here waiting for us. Okay? So that's what this code does. It gets them ready to, so that way we won't have glitches and we won't have runtime errors. The bullets are ready to go. They're created. Okay? This is the code we'll write today in a second. Notice it looks very much like our bullets code. But we're just kind of reviewing our code first. So we'll come back to that enemy code. And then we added our event listeners. So we added a mouse move, a mouse down, and an enter frame. So when we move the mouse, we call this method. When our mouse is down and that event listener is fired, we call this method. And when we enter our frame, which happens 24 times a second, we call this method. Okay, so you guys should at this point in the class know how event listeners work. Okay, and realize that those second arguments there connect to our methods, our functions that we make. Okay? All right. And our on-enter frame, we'll write this code today, and we'll write our enemy code. But remember that we made our for each loop. For each loops let us iterate through a vector. It's called iterating through the vector. That means it lets us look at every single bullet in the vector. So if you visualize that picture of the vector, it starts at index 0 and goes all the way to index 9, one at a time. Okay, so this for each loop is going to loop 10 times. All right. And for each bullet, it's going to check, are you not invisible? If you're not invisible, then I'm going to move you up the screen by 5 pixels. Okay, because remember our y going up is a negative y. So we add -5 to our bullet objects. And then if you've reached the top of the screen, meaning that you're at -100, that means you're way up above the stage, then we make you disappear. And remember that we wrote this function in the bullet class. Okay, so we actually edited our bullet class. Do you remember editing our bullet class? Hopefully. In fact, we can jump over and look at our bullet class really quick. So remember, this is the class that we edited last time. And so this was the first time that we've actually edited one of our objects' classes. And we did this so that we could give each bullet this new property of being invisible or not invisible. Okay? So we made this new instance variable for all of our bullets, so it's a new property of our bullet objects. And remember, we made it of type Boolean, so he's either on or off, true or false. So you're either invisible, true, or not invisible, false. All right. Now we had to make a constructor. Actually, the constructor was made for us. And we said, okay, we'll set you invisible to true to start out with. So when I create you, we'll set that instance variable to true. So we're instantiating our invisible property. And then we made these helpful functions. Do you remember what this one was called? Our set invisible was called a set function. Sometimes it's called a mutator function. Okay, that's the more proper term. It's called a mutator because it's mutating or changing our visible property. And when you go to other programming languages, that's what they call them. They call them set functions or mutator functions. And then we had our get function, our get invisible. It returns that property to us, and we had to do this because we made him private. So in order to access him outside of the class, we had to have this function. And this one's called our get function or our accessor function. If you know other programming languages, that should be familiar to you, an accessor function. And then we made these cool functions to help us out write our code. Remember, this is our disappear function. And when we call disappear, it makes the bullet's invisible property to true, and then it sets its x and y to -500, -500, so it throws them up on the stage way over here. So it hides him. We didn't want to destroy him all the way, otherwise we get null object reference errors and a big mess. So we've learned that instead of making him disappear from the stage or remove the child from the stage, which wasn't a good plan, we just stick him up here and put him out of the way so you can't see him on the stage. And then our reappear function lets us do the opposite. It lets us put it on the stage. And so we say, okay, here's your x value, here's your y value, and these are called our parameters. Okay, parameters is a good word to know. So our parameters are set x and set y. So remember that these are called parameters here. And then whatever those parameters are, that's what we set that current bullet's x and y value to. Okay? So just remember that what those functions do. All right, going back to our RAS file. So when we make him disappear, what's he doing? He's setting his x and y up here on the left, setting his invisible to true. Now we'll write this code today. This is to see if we've hit an enemy or not. So remember, when our mouse down, we did write this code on Monday. Hopefully you wrote all these comments in there too. First we check our number of bullets to see if there's a bullet to be added. This is true. Then we do our for each loop. So we know how the for each loop works. It iterates through our vector. Okay. And if that bullet is invisible, then we make him reappear. And hopefully you changed your code. We make him reappear where the player's x and y value is, so it looks like the bullet is coming out of the player. And then importantly, we break. And do you guys remember what break does? It takes us out of the loop because we fired one bullet. We don't want to go around again and fire more bullets. So we break out of our for loop. Okay. You guys should have had this code working on Monday. All right. And then our mouse move was one of the first functions we created on Monday. This one was pretty easy to think about. Where we're moving the mouse is to the left of the player. Then this would be true. And we move our player to the left. And if where we're moving the mouse is to the right of the player, this would be true. and then we move our player to the right. And then we put these trace statements in there just so we could see what our code was doing. All right. Any questions on our code then? Kind of reviewed it. We're familiar with it.
Line 142,
Mm-hmm.
mouse move. Didn't you change that mouse move?
Oh, yeah, I did. Oh, yeah, you can change it. Now, remember, if you change it here, then you have to change it up here in our listener event. And it's because we're using an older version of Flash here that we get like those errors. And Flash Creative Cloud, Flash Professional Creative Cloud, I do not get those errors. So on my computer at home, I don't get any kind of warnings. So remember, it doesn't matter what you call your functions, really. You can call them X and Y if you really want to. But this function name just has to match what you name it down here. So that's the important part. Doesn't matter really what you call them as long as those two match. And then we like to follow kind of the rule, you know, standard that we always lowercase our function names. If I uppercase them, the compiler could care less, but we as humans like to be lowercase because that's what we recognize as function names. All right. So hopefully your code is working. It should work to the point where you can move your character back and forth. Remember, that's on the on-mouse moved function. And you should be able to fire bullets at this point in your code. And the bullets should move up the screen because on the enter frame event, we told those bullets in that for each loop to move up the screen if they are not invisible. All right, so let's start in. And we will start and make our enemy first. So I added to our notes here. I put a little line here where we start off again. And so our first step is we're going to make an enemy object in our flaw file. So we want to make our enemies appear from the top of the stage, have them come down to attack our player. The player will shoot its bullets at the enemies and hopefully hit a couple. And the enemies that the player hits should explode and disappear. Okay? So first things first, let's make the enemy object in the flaw file. Remember to capitalize your class names and export for ActionScript. And then we're going to edit that file. We're going to edit our enemy class file to look like this. And the reason being is we want our enemy kind of to work like that bullet. We want the enemies to disappear and become invisible when they get hit by a bullet. So we're going to use that same invisible property. We're going to add it to our enemy class. We're going to add it the same way. In fact, you could copy and paste code. The only thing that's a little bit different is we're going to store them off the stage at a different location. Notice in our bullets we had -500, -500. But if they store in the same location, then the bullets are constantly hitting the enemies and the enemies are dying over here. And you could try it out. But then when we add them, you can see that their death sequence is happening after we add them. So we like to store them off the stage in a separate location. Okay? All right. So let's do those steps. So go to your flaw file, and I'll even make a new enemy. Now, for now, you can just make your enemy, you know, something. I'll make him a square this time. And remember that it's very easy to replace these. Last time I made it an oval. Let's make my enemy a square. All right. So kind of a boring game with boring characters for now, but we'll make them better in a second. All right. So just make some kind of object to represent the enemy for now. Sorry. And then use your selection tool. Select your enemy. Select that object. And then we press our F8 key. You guys should know how to do this now. F8 key to make a movie clip symbol. We're converting it to a movie clip symbol so it can have those properties of a movie clip. And remember to capitalize your movie clip name. I'm going to call him enemy 2. You guys can just call him enemy I'm going to call him enemy 2 because I already have an enemy, so he would have a problem with that name. All right. And then export for action script. Press OK. It'll make that class path file. And then right click, go to properties again, and if you want to edit its class file, the easiest way to kind of open it is to hit that little pencil icon right here. So the pencil icon will say, oh, okay, you want to edit the class file. Do you want to edit it in Flash Professional or Flash Builder? We'll say Flash Professional. And it opens up our class file. And then if you really want to, you could copy and paste a lot of this bullet code in there because it's going to be the same. So to kind of help yourself out. But now you are going to have to change some of this stuff. Not all of it, just a little bit of it. So if you wanted to, you could copy and paste it right underneath the constructor, and then we'll have to edit it. Or you can just write him fresh. And I did put a copy of that code here. Okay, so what he looks like is right over here. Now you can add comments in here. I would encourage you guys to write comments to yourself about what it's doing. You guys will be responsible for knowing what this code does. Remember what your accessor function is and your mutator. Okay. And then remember to save it, and the default location to save it should be in the same file as your other files. And so importantly, save him after you're done. The things you'll want to change once you copy and paste this is you can put this instance variable at the top. Now this instance variable is going to have nothing to do with the bullets instance variable because they're private. It's only seen within this class. So it's okay to have an instance variable with the same name. You could copy this constructor code to your constructor code. And then you could delete that bullets constructor code because obviously we don't need to construct a bullet in here. Now this set function and mutator function and disappear function and reappear function, it is all the same. And then last but not least, you can name your curly brackets. All right. So I'll let you guys work on that in a second. I saw somebody raise their hand, so I'm going to go check it out for a second. So we'll pause this. All right. So looking at our notes, we can look in our notes here. We're going to add a vector of enemy objects so that we don't get any runtime errors. We're going to create and instantiate them. You should know where to declare these things, and you should know where to instantiate them now. Okay, at this point in the class, you should know that, hey, we declare our objects with our instance variables, and we instantiate them in the constructor. Okay. So we're going to make a vector of enemy so that we can encapsulate them and treat them as a single unit. Okay, remember that picture, we're making a vector. We instantiate the vector, and then we instantiate all of our enemy objects, and we're pushing them into our enemy's vector. Okay. Now I named a lot of these very similar names, but remember that they are different variables. Enemies is different than enemy. An enemy with a lowercase letter is different than enemy with an uppercase letter. Enemy with an uppercase letter is our class name. Enemy with a lowercase letter is a variable. Okay, so they do have similar names, so pay attention to the names here. It is important that you get the correct name and that you realize which object is which object. So enemies is a vector, so we can push enemy, which is an object of type enemy with a capital letter. Now you can name these different names if you want, but this is just kind of customary to name them like this. Okay, it's kind of standard. All right? All right, so let's add that code in here. So we're going to add it to our AS file, of course. So first you'll instantiate your enemy's vector. So you can name your vector what you want. If you have a certain type of enemies that you want to create, you don't have to name it this. This is just a variable name that I created. Okay. But you should use the colon then, and you do have to use the vector type. And then inside of these less than, greater than symbol, this is our generics to say what type of objects our vector was going to hold. And I can even make him hold an enemy2 object now that I have enemy2 objects. So whatever you named your class file back in your flaw is what you're going to put here. Remember, that was the file we just edited, the enemy2 objects. Okay, so we're making a vector of those objects. So we declare them, of course, with the other instance variables up at the top here. And then you could copy and paste your bullet instantiation code because look at enemies looks very similar to this. So if you wanted to copy and paste this code, you could. Right? Now remember what your code is doing. So don't just, blindly copy and paste and not realize what this code is doing. First, we're instantiating the new vector with a vector constructor. And if I want them to be of type enemy2, I would put enemy2 here. And then we're instantiating a whole bunch of enemy objects and pushing them into our vector. How many enemy objects are we creating? I created only 10. Remember, if you wanted more enemies, you would loop through a couple more times. You could change that. If you wanted less enemies, you could loop through a little bit less times. So this just tells us how many enemies we're going to have in our game. All right. We make a new enemy object, okay, using some code in our new operator. And if I wanted a new enemy2 object, I could put, okay, you're an enemy2 type object. So this is the type. This is his constructor. Remember that this constructor relates to this constructor, so it runs this code. Okay, so when I call that constructor, it's running that code from my enemy2 class. Okay, do you see how that function name is the constructor name? And then importantly, we push it into our vector so that we can keep track of that enemy object. And then we called his disappear function, which we wrote inside of his class, so he knows what disappear is. And then importantly, we added him to the stage so that we won't get any null pointer reference errors and that he'll appear. Okay. No, I didn't label my ending curly brackets, but remember that you could label these too. Because we do have a lot of curly brackets in our code because we do have to encapsulate things. So remember our for loop works such that it runs to the top of the curly bracket to the ending curly bracket and then it repeats until this is false. So it's going to happen 10 times. You can think in here it's going to 10 times, make 10 enemies, stick them into our vector. And that should make sense, okay? So if it doesn't, go home and stare at that code till it makes sense. But you should start to realize what this code is doing and how a for loop works by now in the class, okay? And remember, if you're confused about how a for loop works, you could put some trace statements in here, trace what I is on every loop, or you can ask me, okay? So that instantiates our enemies. Now our enemies are still not going to appear. You can compile this code, okay, and you can run him, but he's still not going to appear because we told them to disappear, which means they're up here on the stage. So they are on the stage, but they're way over here. We can't see them yet. So now we need to make them appear on the stage. Okay? So to make them appear on the stage, we are going to write a new function called make an enemy function. Now the way that I've created the make an enemy function is I use a random, I multiply it by 10, I even trace that variable so we can see what that variable is. And so remember that random is giving us a number between 0 and 1, and when I multiply it by 10, I'm getting a number between 0 and 9. And it does have decimals at the end. So when you trace this, you can see how that works. Now, if I wanted them to appear more often, I would make this a lower number. And if I want them to appear less often, I would make this a higher number. Because I'm checking, I'm saying, okay, if that random number is greater than 9.8, then I'll run this for each loop, which is the same type of for each loop we had for our bullets, which says, hey, if you're invisible, go ahead and make a random number for my X position, reappear at that position, and then break. So it randomly puts them on the stage. If you want them to appear at a certain location, you wouldn't use math.random here. You would use either a variable or hard code a location where you want your enemy to appear in the X position. I just did it random. All right. 9.8. Okay, where did I get that number? I just kind of played around with it. You could play around with that number. So it's only going to happen 0.2% of the time. Remember that this function we're going to add to the onEnter frame event, so this function is going to be called 24 times a second. So you'd be surprised how many times our random number is going to be greater than 9.8. Okay, so but you could play around with that 9.8 number. So you'll write this function. I put lots of comments in there. I kind of expect you guys to write the comments too so you realize what's happening. And I said you can change this function to use a counter and add enemies when this counter reaches a certain count or when the user gets a certain score. And those would be like some, enhancements to your game you could do. I wasn't going to go over how to do that, but, you guys could, it's really easy to kind of do something like that. So, All right. And then we'll call that function in our onEnter frame event. And then in the onEnter frame event, we'll use this for each loop that looks very much like that bullet for each loop that says, hey, if you're not invisible, go ahead and move up or move down the screen. So instead of minus equal, it's plus equal 5. And then if you've moved off the screen, go ahead and disappear. So I'll let you guys kind of write that code. It looks like this. Here's our make an enemy function. Remember to write those comments so we realize what he's doing as you're writing this. And then remember to call him in your code up here. So first you make an enemy. Actually, I just noticed I indented incorrectly. And then use your for each loop to move those enemies up the screen and then make them disappear when they've left the bottom of the screen. Okay, and you could play around with any of these numbers or even make variables instead of numbers here. And then when you get that code in there, when you have your make an enemy and then you're calling it and you're moving your enemies, you should see your enemies move down the screen. There they are. So there's my enemies moving down the screen. Now when you fire your bullets, just like how I'm firing my bullets, we haven't done the hit test function, so they're not going to disappear yet. But you should see them move down the screen. Okay, and that one was stuck there because he was in my flaw. That's what he was saying. Okay, so I'm going to pause our recording for a second so we can make sure that everybody gets their bullets